Hi, we're Group 2, and our group was assigned Dr. Don Marquis' article, Why Abortion is Immoral. Before we begin, we wanted to take a second just to explain why this article is relevant to today's society. The abortion argument is an argument that is deeply rooted in our society. There are those in support of the woman's ability to choose to have an abortion or not, who call themselves pro-choice, and there are those against abortion in nearly all instances who call themselves pro-life. As you can see from the images that we've included, the tension between these two sides is currently at an extreme high with the Supreme Court's verdict last month on Texas's abortion law and the hearing on Mississippi's abortion law scheduled for this summer. The Texas abortion law would make it so that a fetus cannot be aborted after a heartbeat is detected. This could be as early as 6 weeks. For reference, only 34% of abortions take place in the first 6 weeks. What is unique about this law is that it relies on citizens to sue abortion clinics found guilty of providing an abortion too early. A successful prosecution would result in the citizen being paid a reward of $10,000 by the abortion clinic. Meanwhile, the Mississippi abortion law would not allow an abortion after a gestation period of 15 weeks. Uniquely, the Mississippi abortion law would overturn the Roe v. Wade rulings currently in place regarding abortion, cutting down the window to get an abortion by 2 months. The punishment of disobeying this law would be a revocation or suspension of the perpetrating clinic's medical license. Taking into consideration the importance of this debate and the likelihood that this is a subject of importance to many of you in this room, we are now going to dive into Dr. Don Marquis' article, Why Abortion is Immoral, hearing from Dr. Marquis himself.
In this week's interview, the BioEthics podcast is diving into the issue of abortion, why abortion is immoral, by the now professor at the University of Kansas, Don Marquis. Don Marquis, thank you so much for being here.
Yes, it's my pleasure. I'm so excited to be joining you two on the BioEthics podcast.
Yep, it's one of the best widely recognized podcasts in America, so thank you. So we have quite a bit of questions, so we'll get straight to it. You provide a detailed overview in your article regarding the morality of abortion. If you could summarize your main points, maybe let's say 2 to 3, what would they be?
Well, I would first start off by saying that in regards to the morality of abortion, this is one that is very intricate in design. There's a very secular argument, an argument that has no absolute answer. However, if I were to try my best to sum up why abortion is wrong, I would first start off by saying that killing an adult is wrong, right? Whenever we see a news story, for instance, we are quick to feel sadness for the loss of that individual's life. This sadness comes from the mourning of one thing, the loss of a future of that individual, because the loss of a future is everything when it comes to what makes killing wrong. And then that same principle applies whenever a fetus is aborted, because they lose that same value of a future like ours. All in all, it circles back to the main point that abortion is seriously wrong as it results in the loss of one thing, and that thing is the future.
Okay, so let me condense your main points just even more, if you don't mind. Let's see if you agree. So killing adults is wrong, a loss of future, and the same value of future, which, future like ours, leads to your conclusion that abortion is seriously wrong. Those are your main 3 points, you would say.
Yes, I would say that is so.
Gotcha. Okay, so let me ask you this next question. Arguably, the biggest point in your argument is that the act of killing and taking life away from a human being is wrong. I mean, it makes complete sense to me. Why should a fetus be considered a human if, depending on the age of development, lacks the necessary components to be viewed as a human?
Well, I would first start off by saying that I think that unborn children, fetuses, are full subjects of moral consideration, because it really does not matter the state of the being when we're talking about abortion or killing it, for example. The state of the being does not solely define whether or not killing is wrong. For instance, killing me or an adult like you, Jason, or Kourosh, and killing a 5-year-old is all collectively viewed as wrong. If killing an adult like us is wrong, then it should constitute the immorality of killing a fetus, or even killing an animal, or killing an alien for the hell of it, the state of the being does not solely define what makes killing right or wrong. What makes killing wrong is the effect on the victim, no matter what the victim is, what species it is, what stage of development it's at. When I'm killed, I'm deprived of what I now value and what I have come to value, or what could I value.
Gotcha. Let me get this straight. So you brought up that animal alien argument. So are you comparing the death of, let's say, a human being to be on the same stage as killing or dying as, let's say, an animal or an alien? So they're practically, that killing, that death is the exact same thing as what you're saying?
I wouldn't say that I'm making comparisons. I'm just saying that no, it doesn't matter if I was an animal or if you were an alien, I would still feel wrong because we're dying and you're getting killed because of one thing. You're losing the potential of what you value in that moment, what you could have valued, and what you have come to value. It's all about what the future of that individual is, despite what the individual, for instance, is human or an animal or even an ET. We don't know, but it's still wrong because you're losing that future value.
Okay, that makes a lot more sense. So let me push that just a bit more. So your article states that abortion is wrong because of the life it causes to the person. So let's talk experiences, emotions. Keeping with this argument, how can a fetus lose anything it never had? So just feeds back to that question: how can it be a human if it never, becomes a human? How can a fetus lose anything it just never had?
That's a great question. In terms of how can a fetus lose anything it never had, I would first start off by saying that the thing in question that of loss is future, right? The loss of future life. And I would say that the loss of life is not something tangible. It's not something I can physically grab onto. It's not like, for instance, me betting on red and I'm losing $100. I just lost something physical. In this case, the loss of life is intangible. Life is full of hardships. It has failures, but it also has love and joy and success. It's all encompassing experiences and feelings, what creates the human condition and what makes life fulfilling for people like me and you. But that is only allowed to happen if the individual who is supposed to experience that life is allowed to develop. It's not necessarily what it had or what it started with or what it never had, but what it will have, but only if we allow it to grow.
Got it. So let me pass it over to a great pioneer on this subject, and that is Kourosh.
Thank you, Jason. And thanks again, Dr. Marquis, for your time and for being here. We're glad you were able to find your iPad to join us today. So one topic that we've been talking about has been the idea of the loss of the future. And another idea in your article that you mentioned is the future of value. And in regards to that, in your article, you mentioned that abortion is morally wrong as it prevents a fetus from a possible future of value. My question is, does this entail that contraception is wrong as it prevents the potential formation of a fetus to therefore have a future of value?
If I'm understanding the question, you're asking why I think contraception isn't wrong. And I would say that we'll first start off, contraception prevents the actualization of a possible future of value for a person that may or may not potentially be conceived. Contraception, in my eyes, is not immoral in practice because contraception has no identifiable subject of loss of future, because you can't necessarily distinguish what specific egg or sperm is being prevented from meeting up to form a zygote in the case of contraception. You can't necessarily pinpoint the two things to make a zygote, which will further develop into a fetus that's going to lose that one thing that we keep mentioning, that loss of future. There has to be a subject in mind when we're talking about a loss. There's no identifiable subject of loss of future, and that doesn't necessarily make contraception wrong if we're following the points that I'm making regarding abortion.
Awesome, thank you. And you also mentioned that for one's future to be valuable, one needs to value it. Given that a fetus is now remotely mature and does not have any perception, how does one expect the fetus to value its own future?
Well, I would first start off saying that whether or not a fetus or even a person like me who value our future does not necessarily depend on whether us or they themselves value it in that current moment. For example, a person who's experiencing depression, for instance, they may think in their current state that their life is not worth continuing. But if they are able to seek treatment or get out of that mindset or are able to get out of the state of depression that they're currently in, they're still able to live a deeply valuable life, right? The future for that individual with depression in this example has value even though they cannot see the value in it. The same principle applies to a fetus because a person's future can still be valuable whether they value it or not.
Thank you. And that brings me to my next question, which is, so we've been talking a lot about loss of future and future value, but in the same article, you seem to support euthanasia. So I'm confused. I want to know more about how come in one case you support killing despite the philosophy of the future value, which would be the case of euthanasia, while in another case you think it is immoral. And what does this tell about the sanctity of human life and your personal perspective on it?
Okay, well, I would first start off by saying that in regard to the sanctity of human life, this argument of abortion does not apply because we're taking a very secular approach to it, right? And when it comes to whether euthanasia is saying if it's right or wrong, I would say that in the case of euthanasia, which is completely separate than abortion, for instance, say the person who's undergoing euthanasia is someone who's severely and incurably ill, they're facing a future of pain and despair. And with that pain and despair of the future, that means that their future isn't necessarily of value to them because they may wish to end life at that current moment rather than suffering even more of a loss or even more of pain if they continue life, if that makes sense. And then I would further dive into that by saying that in the case of a terminally ill individual who's experienced euthanasia, it may be ending their life at that instance is better than continuing life that's them being unconscious for the rest of their life or stuck to a ventilator or whatever the situation may be. They do not necessarily face a loss of future with value by being killed. And this argument of euthanasia is very different than abortion in my eyes. And they're two things that can't necessarily be compared. It's like comparing apples to oranges, they're two different things.
Let me jump here really quickly. So, because you were not looking at abortion in this paper through, let's say, a religious lens, the sanctity of human life, which states that human life is sacred and precious, doesn't apply to your argument. Is that correct? Did I get that right?
Right. Like this is a very secular approach. And I think that's a big point in this because we're not taking a religious lens at all.
My question is, under what circumstances is abortion moral in your specific case?
Wow, that's a very loaded question. Well, I would first start off by saying that there is no absolute circumstances in which abortion is moral. I don't have a list of like what I think are the exceptions. For instance, I think for these situations that you speak of in which abortion is moral is very individualized to a situation. For instance, if the birth of a child is putting a mother's own life at risk, that becomes a moral debate and question and contention beyond abortion itself. That's a contention between two losses of future value, and then that is a whole nother moral question in itself. Yes, there are rare situations in which abortion can be viewed as a quote unquote better option, but it must be justified by only the most compelling reasons because in my eyes, majority of abortions is morally wrong because of one thing, it's losing that loss. It's losing that possibility of a future value.
Well, Don Marquis, I'll give you the opportunity to conclude your arguments.
I would first say that thank you for having me, and we are addressing the moral contention regarding abortion, and it isn't deciding whether or not a fetus is considered human. This is here we're going beyond that idea. We're questioning whether or not abortion is morally right as it leads to one of the greatest losses in life, the loss of a future. Besides, what is your life for if there's no prospects of a future?
Well, one small final question. I just have to ask this question. So, this argument was produced several decades ago. Society, politics, and virtually every aspect of life have changed since then. So, has your position on the matter changed at all?
Well, Jason, I would just say that I don't think my stance on it has moved even with time changing.
Well, there you have it. After 30 years of having written this piece, Marquez remains adamant about his position towards abortion. Thank you again for being here, Marquez. And for those of you who are subscribed to our weekly podcast, make sure to tune in next week where we interview the one and only Judas Jarvis Thomas. Thank you, everyone.